Well, I am so glad that you're here today with us. I know we're well into the holiday season now, and your calendar is crazy. You being here and making Christ the center of your celebrations this year fills me with joy and adds so much to your life. We're talking about this idea of CenterPeace, and our message last week, if you remember, was this: peace comes if you trade the magic of Christmas for the message of Christmas. This was our first key to having peace. You'll remember we said, let's get the star out of the manger. Let's put the baby back in the manger. As we move on now to this second one, the reason this topic and this entire series is so valuable to our lives is it's so easy to get distracted from what really matters at Christmas time. There are so many different things that can get us distracted. No doubt one of those things is what really began in the ancient times of the giving of gifts. Believe it or not, the whole idea of gifts at Christmas comes from the wise men. Now, can you believe that? Gift giving founded by men of all things. I got to talking to someone recently, said to them, you know what? Imagine poor Mary. She gets these gifts, and they come from men. So undoubtedly, the day after the first Christmas, she's down having to exchange the gifts, and those guys probably didn't even remember to bring their receipts when they came. But ever since then, the idea of gifts has kind of spiraled and grown until, let's all be honest about it, it seems more or less out of control. And consumerism and the focus on things can steal our peace at Christmas time. This is illustrated, as you can see, this whole idea of consumerism by what we have in our manger today. You can see we've gone ahead and got the gifts in the manger. We've got them right there center to what is our holiday celebration. Now, I'm resisting the urge to illustrate this in certain ways. I was tempted to illustrate it by showing you some videos of those famous Rock'em Sock'em Walmart fights. And if you haven't seen them, you can go online, entertain yourself if you want with people who are literally willing to punch people out over important things in life like a big screen TV or a Tickle Me Elmo. And so, but I decided not to do that. Then I was tempted to illustrate our obsession with commercialism and things by mentioning to you that the average American who spends money on Christmas spends nearly $1,000 at the Christmas season. But I decided not to do that either to illustrate it to you. Rather, I have chosen to talk to you today about what really is the antithesis of being caught up in consumerism. In other words, if we could move past what all of the companies are telling us brings satisfaction this time of year, we might discover a truth that lasts not only during this season, but in every season of our life. It's probably summed up well in 1 Timothy chapter 6. It says this: "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. Consumerism, the pursuit of more, plunges us into ruin and destruction. But then there's this wonderful word that is just like a breath of fresh air that lands on us today, and it is this word, contentment. If you can come to a place of contentment this Christmas season, you have found the second secret to peace. Peace comes with contentment. Let me show you today 2 quick paths to more peace and contentment in your life. First one is this, very simply: sometimes less is more. I want you to say that with me. It's very simple. Let's read it off the screen together. Sometimes less is more. In the 6th month, God sent the angel Gabriel to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. God sends his angel to Nazareth. Now, maybe that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but I want you to know Nazareth was such an out-of-the-way, podunk little town that Nathanael, one of those who would follow Jesus, when he learned that the Messiah had come from Nazareth, marveled at the idea that someone as great as Jesus could come from such a rat hole as Nazareth. It was a town of extreme poverty. People there could barely get by, and as they were under the burden of taxation from Rome, these people struggled just to put food on the table. If you're uncertain about the demographic status of Mary and Joseph, we recognize that they were counted among the poor in their day. Because when they dedicated Jesus in the temple in accordance with the law, they were allowed to offer a pigeon as the sacrifice rather than a young lamb as the sacrifice. Those who were wealthy and could do so were required to offer the young lamb. But those who were poor and could not afford it were allowed the substitute sacrifice of the pigeon, and that is what they did. And yet notice that somehow God looks down on Mary and Joseph there in Nazareth and says they are just the right ones. I can't help but believe that the simplicity of their lives, unencumbered by wealth or its pursuit, was a part of what made their hearts so open to the work of God. Now, I know right about now you're thinking, oh, this is just one of those obligatory sermons that pastors have to give about not being consumers at Christmas. And let me say this. If there's some gift you really want to get this Christmas, I hope you get it. If there's some financial capacity you hope that you're going to have so you can give great gifts this year to someone you love, I hope you gain that capacity. But you see, more than all of that, I hope that somehow those things ultimately don't get in the way of you having the kind of heart of contentment that more easily discovers God in this season. Just as Joseph and Mary had in the midst of having very little. Can I tell you that so often we can discover the bigger things in life when there are less possessions in the way? Just ask Sharon Spano. She shares her own story of Christmas. Just last year, 2014, she and her husband had been planning a very special trip to go to Savannah, Georgia for Christmas. But just a few days before they were to leave, she came down with the terrible flu. Her husband ended up having to cancel all the plans that they had made and the plane flights and all that they were excited to do. They hadn't even decorated their own home, knowing they were going to be away for Christmas at their children's home. They didn't have anything in the house planned for any great Christmas meals. And in fact, Sharon tells that how she spent the day before Christmas and Christmas Day laying on the couch underneath 3 blankets, trying to get warm from the chills that she had, and eating the simple chicken soup that her husband had heated up for her. And so on Christmas night, she shared how, trying to get warm, she decided she would go in and get just as scalding hot of a shower as she could stand to try to warm up. She said as she was in the shower that night, trying to get warm, her husband peeked his head in the door of the bathroom and said, "Sweetheart, how about I throw your pajamas into the dryer to warm them up a little bit so that when you get out of the shower, you won't get a chill and you can get warm." This is what she said, and I quote her word for word from her article. "That comment was worth more to me than if there had been a diamond bracelet under the tree. Who am I to deserve such a man? And who am I to deserve the unconditional love of God. You see, I fear that sometimes we have so much and we pursue so much that it becomes a blockade to the kind of contentment that God wants us to experience this Christmas season and every season of our lives. I'm convinced that the more we buy, the more difficult we make it for us to understand the simple beauty of the season. I bet if you think back to some of the most meaningful Christmases that you ever experienced or enjoyed as an individual or as a family, you will probably remember that those memories have very little to do with some particular gift you got. And even if the good memory does relate to a gift, I bet if you think it through, what really meant so much is that someone sacrificed to get that gift, or someone was so thoughtful to have come up with the idea of that gift, or to follow through on getting you what they had discovered you wanted. So even the gift itself represented something so much more valuable than the gift. You see, writing a careful budget, cutting back on extravagant spending, focusing on things other than gifts, all can pay to you dividends that are better than money. I read recently of a man who was spending his Saturday waxing his expensive and beloved car. He was a grandpa, had only one grandchild, a grandson, who was 4 years old and was over for the weekend at the house. And that little boy was standing there just off the edge of the driveway saying, "Grandpa, how much longer? How much longer till you're done so that we can play together?" And he said suddenly there was just this epiphany, this moment when the Spirit of God whispered to him. And he said almost out loud, "What am I doing? What am I thinking? I'm missing out on being with my grandson because of the thing." Is it possible to train ourselves that less is more? And there's no better season than Christmas for us to remember that. Here's the second pathway to contentment. Recognize that you cannot control every situation in your life. You cannot control every situation in your life. This is how Mary answered the angel. "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May it be to me as you have said." You know, Mary and Joseph had really a pretty simple plan for their simple life. They were engaged to be married, which that word engaged is a much deeper commitment in that culture than it was here. It basically was pre-marriage. It was married but not in the same home yet. Their simple plan was to go ahead and get married after that year of engagement period, betrothal it was called. They would get married. They would settle into a simple house. They would be surrounded by family that would love them and revere them, and respect would go back and forth. Eventually, as God blessed them, she would get pregnant and they would have children. And all of those simple plans were before them suddenly were tremendously complicated by the appearance of an angel. If you think about it for a moment, Mary and Joseph had every reason to lack peace in their life as a result of what the angel told her. We look back at this story and say, how awesome, how exciting. But I wonder if it really felt that awesome and exciting to Mary and Joseph as they now had to walk through life one step at a time with all the new complications that came with bearing a child. You know, someone mentioned to me the other day that it had to be hard enough for Mary to deal with this, even though she had an angel tell her in advance what to expect, that she would become pregnant because God himself was going to have her bear a son. But imagine what Joseph went through. Joseph observed Mary pregnant long before he ever got a dream that explained it to him. Of all of the words that you might use to describe the Christmas story or think about that first Christmas, you probably wouldn't put shame and disgrace on the list. But that is what is heaped onto Mary and Joseph by their community, undoubtedly, culturally, by members of their own family. When Mary said to the angel, "I'm the Lord's servant, may it be to me as you have said," Mary was signing on for saying, I can't control everything that God has determined is going to happen in my life. She had no idea all that it meant. She didn't have an image at that time of what it would be like to ride that long, difficult trip to Bethlehem, ready to give birth any day. She had no idea of all the turmoil that would go on between her and Joseph. She had no idea that within 2 years of the birth of her son, she and Joseph would have to hurry away from their own nation and become refugees in Egypt. And if I can just make an aside for a moment today, let me say to you that we need to be very careful how we think about the crisis of refugees that's going on around our world right now. And we cannot let fear carry the day for our thinking on the treatment of refugees. And while absolutely it would be pertinent and wise and appropriate for us to use all of the recourse of our government, carefully looking and using wisdom on who comes into this country, we cannot let fear keep us from opening our hearts to those who are genuine refugees. Because remember, there once were 3 refugees named Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And thankfully, there was a nation that took them in. But back to what we're saying, Mary could have never pictured all this. She had no idea all that it meant. But she got to a place in her life where she said, I can learn to be content if I can settle into my heart that I can't control every situation in my life. I can't manipulate them all. She just surrenders her life to God, not even knowing all that will mean. She can't see around the corners into her future, but God can. Recently, I read about a pastor whose son shared his dad's love of sailing. So much so that when the young man graduated from college, he had saved up a bunch of money and had set aside time so that he could attempt to sail all the way around the world. In preparing for his trip, he purchased a lot of sails and gears that were made for very heavy and difficult weather, for storms and high winds. As he was continuing to prepare for this trip and continued to gather more and more of this equipment, one day the father kind of kidded him about all of that material that he was packing with him. And this is what he said, Dad, no one sails 25,000 miles without encountering some storms. I'm not going to be the exception. Sometimes in our lives, it's as if we're surprised when setbacks happen. Why would we think that we would be the exception? Why would we believe that we will never face financial setback? Rather, it should be our expectation that there will be times when in our lives things are difficult financially. And so when we face difficulties that come our way, we're tempted to look at God and say, God, I don't like this. God, I can't believe you're letting this happen to me. But why should we be surprised? Storms come into all of our lives. But if we understand the idea of contentment, if we recognize that we cannot control all the things that will come into our lives, then we can say, God, whether today I have a lot or I have a little, you are in control of my life. And we're going to weather this storm. You see, surface happiness can wax and wane, based on how many things we have or how our finances are going. Worries come and go based on all kinds of triggers and daily events. But contentment is deep enough rooted in our lives that we can say, you know what? I can lie down in peace tonight and sleep, even if I don't have 2 nickels to rub together, because God is in control of my life. May it be to you, Lord, as you have said and as you have determined. You know, control is an illusion. The idea that fiscally and financially we can control all that we might ever face is not possible. We could have at any time a complete bottom dropping out within our economy that would knock down even the wealthiest among us, that would humble every last one of us. Things can come your way that you never expect. Bills could come up on you and financial things as a result of sickness that you could never imagine. It is an illusion to say, I can always call the shots for what will happen in my life financially. So contentment says, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what happens to my finances. So many times I have heard from people who say, everything was going along great. My company was having its best year ever. But then the contract went away. I was the top salesperson in my division, and the future was looking so bright. But all of a sudden, our company was taken over by a larger company, and they simply phased out of this state. And story after story after story of someone who says, I felt like I was on financially firm ground, but today I have nothing. Or I went through a period of time when we lost everything that we had and thought we could depend upon. As a pastor, so many times I've been blessed to have people who tell those stories to me come and say, but that is when I turned to God's word. That's when I came to a new place of dependence and desperation before God. And that's when the contentment and the peace settled into my life. Paul said it this way, I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. If you look at those verses on the screen, you'll notice that the 2 verses say almost the identical thing twice. It's as if Paul said it once and then said, I should say it again. It's as if Paul said it once and then said, I should say it again. Paul doesn't very often repeat himself like that. He does so here with, I think, emphasis on a word that I want you to see, and it's this. He says, I have learned. Learned. I believe to come to a place of true contentment in our life is a learning curve. Getting our thinking right about possessions and financial security and the uncertainty of money and all those things, I believe we have to learn how to do that. You know, you can't control all your circumstances, but you can control your response. And so here's a simple little way to think about it as we wrap up, and it's this. We can learn to choose enough over more. Say that twice with me. Choose enough over more. Choose enough over more. Paul said, I was content. Because when there wasn't very much, I said, it's enough. And when there was a bunch, I said, it's enough. Even when I was hungry, somehow there'd be enough. When I was well fed, thank you, God, that there's enough. this Christmas? Can you look at the way you're going to deal with the gifts? And the way you're going to deal with your finances, and the way you're going to deal with whatever your financial downturn or uptick is? Can you look at that and say, this Christmas, I'm coming from a position of contentment? If you will, oh, there's going to be great peace in your life. I want to throw 5 practical things up on the screen real quick for you. We're going to do this in 60 seconds and go on our way. Here's just some practical ways that you can walk away from this sermon and say, okay, how do I begin to train into myself to learn this idea of contentment? Number 1, stop to really thank God for what you have. Do not think about what you don't have. Stop and say, God, here's what I want to thank you for what you've given to me. Number 2, write a humble budget for Christmas this year and stick to it. Consider cutting back by 20 or 30 or 40% from what you did last year. Number 3, dial back expectations. Right from the beginning, figure out how not to set your heart so much on, I've got to have that, I've got to have this. Kids, stop saying to your parents, you know what, I really want this or I really want that. Just dial back the expectations. Plan on being blessed by whatever you find under the tree Christmas morning. Number 4, train your kids. You know how many gifts Jesus got at Christmas? 3. Do our kids really need 4 or 5 times that many? My kids were walking down the road with me the other day, and I said, you know what, guys, this year for Christmas, we're really going to kind of cut back and keep it humble. And they turned and looked, they said, Dad, we always have the cut back and keep it humble discussion about this time of year. And they laughed and smiled and said, we're good with that. I hope I'm living up to what I promised them this year about keeping it humble. Number 5, I said there was 5, there's actually 6. Here's the 5th one. Find a person or family in need and spend as much on them as you're about to on yourself. So write your budget, then cut it in half and say, here's what we're going to give away. Finally, number 6, consider family events in lieu of so many gifts. Now, some of those family events will have some expense to them. I don't mean they have to be family events with no cost. But consider events together in lieu of gifts. Because I can tell you something, most of us can't remember most of what we got for Christmas last year, but many of us can remember the memories that we have made. So choose experience over extravagant gifts. This is a practical way. These are just applications by which you can walk away today and say, I can enjoy more of the peace of Christmas if I get consumerism out of the center and put contentment where it belongs. And in being content, I'm seeking after the Christ of Christmas who belongs in the center point in the manger. Would you bow your heads with me as we pray together and close?